Haus der Kunst in Munich, working on the research topic post-colonial 1955 through 1980. She is an independent curator, writer and editor. She was co-editor of Prelom, Journal of Images and Politics in the early 2000s, and co-founder of the independent organization Prelom Collective. Many of her lecture performances, texts, and publications are actually coming out of collective thinking and collective activities. I recently had the pleasure to be in the audience of her lecture performance in Berlin that dealt with non-aligned modernities and movements. So, welcome, a warm welcome to Jelena Vesić, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. First, of course, I would like to thank the organizers and conceptual organizers, I would say curators of this very interesting conversation and a panel and a series of lectures. So thank you, Rike, for inviting me. Thank you, Beatrice, for inviting me, and thank you, Sophie, for a great organization of the event. And I would also like to thank the colleagues who have given their presentations so far, to Lara, Sarah, and Lucy, because I think all these presentations are actually contributing a lot, and in the end we will be able to find some points of connections between all the presentations, and I think there are many, and that entire thing works well together, or maybe troubles the regular flow, which is perhaps the best. So, okay, my talk is titled "Exhibition History and Canons of Contemporaneity, or Why Looking at the Darkness of Our Own Time Helps Us to See It Better." What is it? It is both history and contemporaneity. So actually, I'm posing the question, is it possible to think the exhibition history beyond the standardized academic forms of knowledge production, that is, beyond the canons of global contemporaneity? So is it possible not to fall again with establishing new discipline into some kind of form of academicism? So is it possible to kind of escape this academic manner of listing the exhibitions that made art history, or producing monographies of big curators, authors, mimicking the previously operating form of great artists, great authors? So great artists and great authors as great authors, and nowadays within the field of exhibition history, quite often the curators are taking actually structurally the same position. Or, in example, is it possible to avoid the thinking of exhibition history through re-exhibiting grand exhibitions as artworks, and of course the most famous example of such a procedure was this re-exhibiting of famous When Attitudes Became Forms in Prada Foundation at Venice Biennial. Writing about entanglements of history and contemporaneity, philosopher Giorgio Agamben speaks about kind of observer who firmly holds her gaze on her own times so as to perceive not its light but rather its darkness. So darkness here appears not in a sense of social darkness, but rather of perceiving of what is obscured, what's hidden under the light spot. So we normally say, you know, like that the things should be lit, should be lit actually. I think my understanding of this quote is the try to that this idea is a try to not to equalize contemporaneity with the notion of now, but also to introduce with this notion of contemporary and also with the notion of history that's contemporaneized in a certain way, something of a methods of discontinuity and anachronism. And this observer who firmly holds her gaze on her own times so as perceive not its light but rather its darkness reminds me to the figure that we can also recognize as non-integrated spectator, so the one examining precisely what is obscured or darkened by the light of epoch. And the term of non-integrated spectator comes from Walter Benjamin, and I would translate it as a misfit with sharp eye. So non-integrated spectator is a kind of misfit with sharp eye. So the subject who is capable and willing to unlearn. Also the notion of unlearning, that's a kind of in the current of contemporary post-colonial thinking, and we can collect it to Gaetari Spivak among others, so the term which is kind of struggling against the epistemic violence. Okay. How do we perceive contemporaneity, and what's the burden actually of our times? What's the burden of contemporaneity? I connect it to the term of the super now, which I call super now. In the last decades of the 20th century, the news came that the future is over and that we now live in the age of fractalization of time. Ever since, the world is presented with various recreations of past produced for the various aesthetic political purposes. Our era of destabilization constantly and automatically recalibrates itself to the state of all-encompassing momentariness, here, now, and everywhere. Chasing the contemporary, trying to be with time in globalized space, we are captured by the logic of super-now introduced by the sensory overload of the surrounding infosphere. We are determinately demented and oblivious. Our memory mirrors this Facebook network machine in a sense that each minute one novelty or attraction pushes into the oblivion the previous one. Our memories are stimulated through the mediation of various different paths, spectacularly presented in reality shows like digests on dedicated history channels. Everything, including the world wars, now runs again, and this time in color. After the abolishment of the universal promise of historical progress towards better future, we are provided with an illusion that we live in the era of chrono-democracy, where all modalities of time are reachable and easily accessible, ready to be performed, experienced, consumed, and recreated in different micro-environments, accommodating different individual choices. So the questions are, does history still bears the potential to produce, once again, a collective consciousness that may lead to new totality of the better now? Can it become re-actualized as a transformative experience? Can it break with the infinite perpetuation of the shape-shifting supernow? And I would say that canonic curatorial logic, the logic of contemporary curator that I was also taught of in this peak of the curatorial education when I was attending curatorial course at the Appel, and when I observe it from like 10 and more years after, I would say that this canonic contemporary curatorial logic is coexisting with this shape-shifting supernow. that the dominant role of curator today is reduced to administration of novelties, which are quite often just spectacularized and repacked oddities, old new artworks, old new art places, old new exhibitions. So what I would try to talk about today, and also through some examples, would be an attempt to imagine the community of non-integrated spectators created through history of contemporary times. The contemporary times, of course, contemporaneity is historicized differently. Some art historians would say that contemporaneity begins in the 90s. Some would say after 1989, so after the collapse of communism, while the others would say the contemporaneity begins in 60s and 70s, which is something that I agree with, formally speaking. I mean, not formally speaking, but speaking about form, exhibition form. So I will also speak about the moments of critical writing in the exhibition space, looking at the cases of artistic and curatorial interventions, the gestures of counter-exhibitionists, non-representationalists, communitarians, and discussionists, and observing the ways by which these critical gestures break with the linguistics of normality of conventional exhibition making. And I will mostly find examples within a Yugoslav space that I kind of culturally, politically, or maybe politically come from, but observing it as international space. So giving examples that are specific and contextualized, but not exotified and not violently tied to locality, to localism, but observed as something that is maybe or can be maybe international. Okay, in relation to supernow, to the mode of supernow, but also to our contemporary understanding of time and experience of time. I'm showing here the art book project comprising of 42 pages of the recently passed away artist Mladen Stilinović, the project which is called I Don't Have Time, in which the artist wrote, we don't know how many times, I don't have time, I don't have time. So this is the only text of the book. In these 42 pages, it's written, I don't have time, I don't have time, I don't have time. And on the front page, it's written, I wrote this book when I didn't have time. I wish that you read it when you don't have time. So I have to also run in order to fit in this I don't have time minutage of the talk. Okay, contemporary art, to return to the question of contemporary art, and I put some of the features of contemporary art or contemporary times, some like obligatory ingredients of contemporary in every contemporary exhibition or contemporary meeting, etc., etc. But okay, actually, the question which is perpetuating is the question, what is contemporaneity? Is it a new form of temporality? Is it new periodizing concept, new material form of cognitive aesthetic labor? And these examinations of the question of what is contemporary can be followed from the 90s up to today through different discussions. Some of them are institutionalized or put together within journals, like Iflux conversation about contemporary, or October journal, and there are, of course, many other singular efforts of famous or less famous theoreticians, curators, and artists to answer this question, what's contemporary. So if postmodern was understood as a cultural mode, or rather an epoch that announced the end of grand narratives after the demise of modernism, as Lyotard said, or was used as a periodizing concept employed by the critics to express the cultural logic of late capitalist production, which is Jamieson's thesis. When is then the contemporary art? What is this? A strictly chronological term, or also an aesthetic one, or maybe both? Octavian Nesanu, art theoretician and one of the editors of the journal Art Margins, thinks that unlike postmodern, which appeared as immaterial mode or an abstract logic introduced and theoretized by critics from within the walls of academia, the phenomenon of contemporary art, and that this is maybe the main feature of the phenomenon of contemporary art, seems to extend and exist across and within diverse parts of the real world: academia, the culture, the industry, the finance, services, and businesses. So in case of contemporary, there are really existing institutions which carry the term of contemporary in their name. We've never heard of the Museum for Postmodern Art or the Gallery for Postmodern Art, but of course we've heard for many spaces, many institutions, many courses, many things that carry in their name the notion of contemporary, although we are not sure how to define this contemporary. So contemporary art, if we now use these two words together, refers to the specific conditions of artistic production that have flourished under the latest phase of global capitalism, a phase known in some areas as neoliberalism, in others as neoconservatism, corporatism, free market economy, or laissez-faire economics. In post-Yugoslav context, contemporaneity appears as a fact of post-socialist transition or managerial revolution. It was cheered up by Soros Centers of Contemporary Art. Perhaps some of you know about the Hungarian-born and American situated, also financially, businessman George Soros, who established networks of Soros Centers of Contemporary Art throughout Eastern Europe and also former Yugoslavia. So, through introduction of what Octavian Nesanu also discusses as capitalism by design. And contemporary art and contemporary times introduced another shift. They also moved us towards another label, the label of global art. And we also went through important institutional shifts, or the changes in spatial terms, in terms of the space. So it is the change of the institutional framework, which was previously white cube of the museum, gallery, space, so which was kind of connected to the national welfare state institution. And today, in the era of contemporaneity, we rather speak of the institution which is a bit nomadic and which is based on the concept of event culture and on mega exhibitions, which are known as biennials. So this is this event culture or biennial culture, which means that formally also the space of presenting contemporary art changes a lot, and it becomes so from the white cube a kind of thing in itself, as Brian O'Doherty would put it, like the space is a thing in itself. White cube, we are arriving to shape-shifting institutional walls, the walls that are moving. Actually, this is the maze of walls as a scenographical representation of contemporaneity, and these are these mobile, built, rebuilt, and tear down walls, characteristic for contemporary exhibition practice and for contemporary event culture. So this picture, of course, we can never have this view on the exhibition. So this is the maquette of the current show, which is presented in Haus der Kunst. So one of the first projects that I would like to shortly pull out of the darkness, or point or shed light to the darkness that the project was dealing with, is the project from Documenta 12 magazine project. So in the moment where this field of exhibition histories that we are talking about today was kind of still emerging and in the process of institutionalization, the three performative groups and performative artists from the three performative groups from Ljubljana, Zagreb and Belgrade, associated with three journals, Frakcija, Maska and TKH, Walking Theory, made fantastic, I think, intervention into this emerging field of exhibition histories. And because their choreographical intervention in the space of exhibition histories of Documenta was precisely related to the pointing to where the walls were built, over the history of Documenta. So not which artworks were shown, which curators, which concepts were presented, but where these walls were built, and their performance had this really nomen est omen character. It was called Art in the Age of Knauf. I think it's great title, and I think that contemporary art can be also called Art in the Age of Knauf. This is another image from their performance. The second example is connected to Zagreb's situation of student cultural center, and to the name of curator Želimir Koščević, who was also before he started his projects in student center in Zagreb, and started experimented with the exhibition matter, or the ways of exhibiting, or maybe non-exhibiting in a ways. I mean, where Lucy said this an exhibit, like with article an exhibit, I originally understood that she said an exhibit, like you an exhibit. So maybe what I'm talking about is an exhibit in this sense. So the example which I'm showing is the exhibition of men and women, one of the early experiments of Želimir Koščević, curator who was working as a curator in the gallery of Student Center. And I mean, even before this exhibition experiments and artistic experiments with the dematerialization took place in the region, which was mostly the very end of 60s and the beginning of 70s. He introduced some kind of curatorial practice, which obviously borders with artistic gesture, because the curator abandons to just administrate the artworks in a sense of exhibiting them in a space, but thinks of what the exhibition is, and what can be said of exhibition by means of exhibiting or unexhibiting. So the exhibition of men and women was announced by leaflets. And in the time which is announced as a time of the exhibition opening, the gallery was opened and as empty, and confused visitors were entering this empty space, and they were also getting some other leaflets in which it was written that they are supposed to be exhibition. The text on the leaflets was, "Be, for the God's sake, the exhibition. In this exhibition, it is you who are the artwork. You are the figuration. You are socialist realism. Look, it is your eyes staring at you. Your body in space, a body in motion. Your kinetic sculpture, your spatial dynamism. Art is not besides you. Either it's not there, or the art, it's you." So he introduces one of these radical gestures of dematerialization of not merely the artwork, but also of the exhibit. And I mean, in a way, speaks about the community, like the exhibition community, as something that is the most important for the exhibition. And this gesture was reenacted by Curatorial collective by How and For Whom from Zagreb, also a bit less than 10 years ago, but something like that. And these were the first attempts to talk about exhibition history, to talk about local exhibition history, but also to select the examples that are somehow talking about darkness of both our own times and the times where the exhibition actually took place. Another example, also Croatian artist Goran Trbuljak, who made the exhibition in the Salon of Museum of Contemporary Art, so like even significant institutional place where artist is, which is appropriate for the retrospective of artistic works. And because he was one of these lazy artists, he exhibited this text, I mean, which is composed of the sentences that were exhibited before. So, I mean, what's the structure of exhibition, of retrospective exhibition? The structure of retrospective exhibition is that you have some artworks which you show somewhere, and that you also have some other artworks that you show somewhere else, and some plus artworks that you were showing in another places, and then you put them all together. So he said, I don't want to, and this was the piece presented on the central wall of the, again, empty gallery space. Retrospective, I don't want to exhibit anything new and original. This was the first exhibition, I mean, exhibition that he presented before in the Gallery of Student Cultural Center in Zagreb in '71. Then the second piece was the fact that somebody is given possibility to make an exhibition is more important than what will be shown at the exhibition. The artwork, under quote marks, that he exhibited in the Gallery of Contemporary Art in Zagreb in '73, and the third one, with this show, I maintained the continuity in my work. So he was really like pronouncing more or less, if we spoke before about Alan Capro's instructions for the observers of the exhibition. I mean, these are like the instructions, or this exhibiting, non-exhibiting actually shows the very structure of exhibiting, or the very structure of the exhibition in a form of instruction in a way. I'm also showing some of the leftovers of the project called the International Strike of Artists by Goran Đorđević, artist born in Pristina and who also worked in Belgrade Student Cultural Center, and who in one moment, this is the call for the international strike of artists was in '79, but who in one moment actually disappeared from the artistic scene, withdrawn from the art context as the consequence of his radical approach to art and originality, but I will tell about this a little later. So this exhibition actually manifests an interesting position shared by many Yugoslav conceptual artists, which is the position of a kind of a true belief in the emancipatory potential of new art. I mean, this change of artistic paradigm in the 60s and 70s. And this belief was often challenged by the ongoing tendency to aestheticize and monumentalize conceptual art practices in the West, which was stimulated by commercial goals of the expanded art market. So in example one of such an examples where the artists from former Yugoslavia participating in a big like a biennial showing the new art practices or this new art, which was a historically very important institution, Biennial of Young Artists in Paris. This biennial was very important for like international spreading of this new artistic paradigm. They were really unhappy, all of them. I mean, the participants of exhibition, when seeing Joseph Kossuth, one of these neon light artworks, as a very in a very monumental form. So, as I said, one of the first radical manifestations of such atmosphere in Belgrade context was Đorđević's call for the international strike of artists in '79, which preceded his exhibition against art, and tested critical ground of conceptual art scene at the end of the decade. Đorđević sent call to a multitude of critical and political artists and curators, inviting them to go on international strike, in his words, against the art system's unbroken repression of the artists and alienation from the results of their work. By doing this, Đorđević intentionally played the role of naive subject, which enabled him to suggest radical halting of art production on the international level. Or, in other words, he performed an impossible assumption on the possibility of universal agreement of international strike of all artists. Đorđević received about 40 replies to his circular letter inviting people to strike, and the majority of artists expressed doubt that this idea could possibly be realized. Like great institutional critics such as Hans Haake or Lucy Lippard suggested that the logic of transformation or the insertion of the critical gesture into the mainstream art context would work better than a full frontal confrontation and negation, while Kai André, in a very patriarchal and patronizing manner, commenced Đorđević's good English, like a good English of one, like a young provincial artist. And the correspondence between various artists regarding the strike, which never took place, discovered the variety of statements that similarly diagnosed the decline of conceptual art criticism, its pacification and institutionalization. After which Đorđević claimed that, which also overlaps with the year of production, but it was important to also exhibit it, claimed that conceptual art became white kitsch, and that we can only speak of new art not as a new, but as a new tradition. So these are some of the letters. I don't know if I have another 2-3 minutes. Okay. And then after that, and shortly after this exhibition, he will push himself out of the art scene as a consequence of such thinking about art. So his exhibition Against Art in the 1980s, so the year which sort of makes cut between the 80s and the 70s, so between the two logics. So, and this exhibition is one of the good examples manifesting the process or call for unlearning and confronting the epistemic violence of really like true knowledge, like educated art practice, like accepted art practice. Actually, he was unlearning of what is the art normality, and he was acting from the position of over-identification with a subject who is allegedly outside of culture or outside of art. He made such an invitation on a kitsch reproduction, celebrating and romanticizing the figure of artist. So who is the artist? Artist is this kind of elegantly weared guy who is always in a wonderful company of nice girls and who is also perhaps portraying them. Okay, this is like a stereotypical relation, like a gender relation in a majority of art historical examples. They are all placed in a beautiful environment of non-existing romantic garden, in a bit of colonial setting. So all this is part of art historical narration and art historical experience. And he calls the exhibition against art, and he gives a statement. A work of art expresses, among other things, certain attitudes towards art. The works shown at this exhibition are not works of art. They are only attitudes towards art. More precisely, they are attitudes against art. I think it's high time to tear the powdered mask of freedom and humanism of art and reveal its proper face, the face of faithful and humble servant. So, and then he continued to exhibit or non-exhibit the artifacts, I mean non-artifacts, but attitudes towards art, that is attitudes against art, which are all absurd, like in example, the Harbingers of Apocalypse, one of his first painting that he made in a high school, and he preserved it, saved it from some reasons, but this is this kind of painting, like everyone sometimes, you know, like in youth years, makes a painting, a drawing, or a poem or something. So like that everyone in his youth is, or her youth is artist. So like the object that has no value. And next to this object, he shows the preparatory drawings, which we know from art history. Preparatory drawings are also something that, you know, like is done beforehand of making the masterpiece, the great artwork, and which precedes the masterpiece or a great artwork, and or sometimes is saved in a museum, collected by the museum, or shown in the museum collection as if the artwork is not existent. So, but he exhibited this painting that he saved, as he says, as it served to him as a measure for stupidity, and then made like 20 years after preparatory drawings for this painting, next to which he shown like his scribbles on mathematical formulas, because he was trained as a technical engineer. The scribbles, and then the series of drawings called Short History of Art, which are going actually backwards from conceptual art, like a high land art, high modernism, towards cave art. So like at the beginning, it's the performance of Joseph Beuys. What he was doing is also some kind of ridiculous anti-art approach of making drawings by pencil after the black and white reproductions. So he was looking at the black and white reproductions and making the copies of these reproductions, putting them into the line of how art history is told, but also putting it reverse, so that actually he was claiming that the the Willendorf Venus or Altamira drawings or like a Christ Pantocrator from Palermo are art as a consequence of existence of high modernism and, if you want, Joseph Beuys as a performer. So one of the most paradoxical objects or drawings was to actually make this naive drawing of made after the photography, okay, which in the meantime got its second life in a sense of that it became monumentalized and part of the collection of different museums, showing Joseph Beuys in the moment of performing, but also placing an emphasis on his personality, which was part of performing, so playing with the performing arts as this idea of having now artists speaking in a first person, but here we have the copy, the drawing, like children's drawing of the reproduction of that. So something that's kind of totally countering the logic of conceptual art, and in the end this was exhibited as a self-portrait, so he kind of combined and put together kitsch reproduction and some kind of specific, with glue on some kind of specific object, which also carries reminiscences on the sculptures by Donald Judd. I prepared a little bit more, but as I started, I don't have time, so maybe we end up here, and some other things can be shown through questions, maybe, depending on questions.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much for introducing us to the non-integrated spectator, but also just to pushing a bit further the question of which historical narratives are reinstituted, retold, and in which ways. Are there any questions?
We have one. Beatrice.
Okay, sorry.
We don't have to, yeah.
No, I thought it was very interesting. Thank you very much for your paper, starting out with obscurity after we had before the idea of not showing. So maybe you could elaborate a little more again on the potential that in your eyes, what would you call this? How would you define the relation between obscurity and the exhibitionary? Because you were showing examples in which the exhibition as such was actually used as a counter argument. But would you say, particularly, you ended up with Goran Đorđević, maybe you could elaborate a little more on what he actually raised or what he made visible in terms of using the exhibitionary as an argumentary tool. Because it seems to me very often that he was using the exhibitionary against itself. Yeah, maybe you could elaborate a little more about that. Against itself in terms of blurring the lines between artistic production and exhibitionary production. I think that's what he does. And in terms of obscurity, how does maybe the
Yeah, I think. Okay. First, thank you. I mean, there are 3 questions minimum in your question, I think. Okay. I'll try to keep them all in mind. Okay. First thing, the exhibitions, they are always framed. I mean, when we exhibit, it's not, like an innocent or like a straight line gesture of just showing in public. There is always certain framework, and I think that in the most of exhibitions, although the exhibitions are constructed like that they are showing something that's kind of established or like a little bit established. Especially big exhibitions, they like to present themselves. This is how they are packed. They are packed as if they are presenting, showing something that was not seen. So they justify their reason of existence, so they justify their showing and they glorify, if you will, their showing by claiming that they are showing the things that were not seen before. And I think that counter to that, in example, if you want to compare this with Đorđević, I think that Đorđević has opposite claim, that he shows actually the things that were seen before, which is part of his philosophy on copy that he develops later, and which is copy is maybe one of the most vulgar objects in art. In a sense of what art is, since it's based on these ideas of originality, authorship, singularity, etc. So copying is maybe something that's the most non-artistic, and he presents in this concrete exhibition and in many other exhibitions, he presents things that are known. But in a way, copy turns this known into unknown. So copy, in a way, serves to estrange something that is known. So to kind of persuade the observer, processually, to enter the process of unlearning and to kind of estrange the facts that are known to him or her. So this is this difference between exhibition practice, the practice of exhibiting, that is always self-justified through these facts. Now we are showing something that is material rarely seen, blah blah. And here we have the opposite thing. The second question, or maybe the third, because I think this was compilation of the two of your question, was the darkness. In Agamben's text, to which I referred, and this is precisely what I liked in this idea or dynamics between lightness and the dark. Because I think we are always hypocritical very much if we say, now I am discovering something. Now I will show you, the pitch dark thing that you've never seen and that you never thought about. This is a self-advertisement of the speaker or of the exhibitor. But what's specific in his thesis is this kind of amelioration, in a way, of light and darkness. He says also himself that to show the darkness, to focus on the obscured, means to show the darkness, but to show also the obscured and the darkness that's inseparable from the light. So that these two things, they coexist. They coexist in time. But while the light, contains its own darkness, but somehow is present and is part of history, or becomes much more easily part of history. This gloominess, it always goes a bit aside from what's in the center. So it's a form of conceptual and willing illiteracy, if you want. In a way, attempt to step aside a bit from what's in the center, but not to distance yourself too much, so that you place yourself on the territory which can be easily exotified as the other, because today, of course, we are all generous to present artists from all around the world, to include each international event is designed like that, so that it presents this friendship and harmony of all the people of the world, almost as if in United Colors of Benetton advertisement. And this is perhaps also very problematic logic, which is a kind of very also straightforward ideological framework of contemporary globalization, which goes hand in hand with the forces of power. And this generosity of white culture to invite, to host, to open the space in the field of, in this participatory field, it is the logic which is problematic. And I don't like to quote very often Slavoj Žižek, but I think he wrote one interesting text about multiculturalism and cultural logic of late capitalism, where he developed, I think, very truthful thesis that multiculturalism is other form of racism, of the racism from distance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Personally, I think for me there are many aspects that I'd like to pick up also in the panel discussion. In particular, not to shorten this discussion here, but also then to ask furthermore, how all of what you just raised, how it influences your current research for the show. And just because most of us, currently joined a conference called The Idea of the Global Museum, and there Mark Coetzee from South Africa said, the global museum, or the idea of the global museum, avoids globalization. And I thought that was a very interesting point, actually, also to say, as you said, just the pure expansion of the same logic doesn't have anything to do with integration or changing the logics.
Yeah, this is the most difficult question of today.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I don't want to stop any discussion, but otherwise I would like to suggest that we have a short break of 15 minutes, and we come back 10 minutes past 4 to Annie Schiffer-Carlson's and Natalie Hoppe-Dammer's presentation, to which we look much forward.